She was my neighbor, older, graceful, untouchable. But one glance, one teasing smile, and suddenly the space between us felt dangerous, and impossible to resist. It began quietly, almost without intention. I had just moved into the neighborhood, still learning the rhythm of the streets, the faces of the people who passed by. And then there was her. My neighbor. She was unlike anyone I had expected to notice. Around 40, maybe a little older, with a presence that seemed both effortless and commanding. She carried herself with a kind of grace that didn't shout for attention but drew it all the same. The first time I saw her, she was in her garden. A wide straw hat shaded her face, but not enough to hide the curve of her smile as she bent toward the roses she had clearly nurtured for years. The late afternoon sun slanted across her, catching strands of her chestnut brown hair that had slipped free from a loose bun. I remember stopping mid-step, pretending to check my phone, just to take in the sight a little longer. She didn't notice me at first, or maybe she did and chose not to let on. What struck me most wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable, but the calm around her. The kind of calm you rarely find in people my age, always rushing, always distracted. She seemed unbothered by time, absorbed in trimming a stem, humming faintly to herself. That hum carried over the fence, low and soft, mingling with the rustle of leaves. Then it happened, our eyes met. It was only a second, maybe two, but I felt it in my chest like the shift of weather. Her eyes were warm, steady, and curious, the kind of look that both unsettles and anchors you at once. She offered me a faint smile, not wide, not playful, just, knowing. It lingered on her lips longer than politeness required, and I felt my face heat in response. I smiled back awkwardly, and for a moment, it felt like we both acknowledged something unspoken. I told myself it was nothing. Just a neighbor being kind. Just a passing glance. But as I walked back into my house, the image of her stayed with me, the way the sunlight had caught her hair, the way she moved with ease, the way she looked at me as though she saw more than I was ready to admit. That night, lying in bed, I realized something had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew it. A door had quietly opened between us, and neither of us had decided whether to close it or step through. The first real exchange between us happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I had gone outside to collect the mail, still half drowsy from a late night, when I saw her walking down the driveway of her home. She wore a pale blue cardigan draped loosely over a white blouse, paired with simple jeans and sandals. Her look was casual, effortless, yet every detail seemed to suit her perfectly. She carried a small stack of envelopes in one hand, her other hand brushing her hair from her face as the breeze lifted it. I pretended to be absorbed in sorting through my letters, though I was aware of her every step. As fate would have it, she paused at the edge of my yard, holding up an envelope with my name on it. "I think this belongs to you," she said, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of amusement. I stepped closer, taking the letter from her. For the briefest moment, our fingers touched, light, accidental, but electric. My pulse jumped, and though I tried to act unaffected, she must have noticed the flicker in my expression. She tilted her head, smiling slightly, as though enjoying a private joke. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. "New neighbors always get the wrong mail," she replied smoothly. "It's the neighborhood's way of forcing introductions." Her humor caught me off guard, and I laughed softly. Guess it worked. The air between us held something unspoken, a subtle charge. She looked at me in a way that felt both teasing and measuring, as if she were curious about how far I'd lean into the conversation. I couldn't help but notice the faint lines at the corners of her eyes when she smiled, not flaws, but marks of experience, of someone who had lived enough life to carry both grace and weight in her presence. I told her I was still settling in, fumbling through unpacked boxes and late-night takeout meals. She chuckled, saying it reminded her of when she first moved here years ago, her voice carrying a softness, a hint of nostalgia. When she finally turned to go, she gave me a glance over her shoulder, the kind that lingers just long enough to leave questions hanging. I stood there in my driveway longer than I needed to, the letter still in my hand, wondering why a simple moment felt so charged. It was nothing more than a casual exchange, and yet it wasn't. There was weight in the brush of her fingers, in the way her eyes searched mine. Something unspoken had begun to take shape. The invitation came unexpectedly, wrapped in her casual charm. It was a Saturday morning, the sky painted with soft streaks of pale orange, and I was dragging my trash cans to the curb when she called out across the yard. "You drink coffee?" she asked, her tone light, though her eyes held that familiar spark of curiosity. "Every morning," I replied with a half-smile. "Good," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Come have one with me. I make mine stronger than the cafe down the street." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because I didn't want to, but because the idea of sitting so close, in her space, felt charged. Still, I nodded, and minutes later I found myself stepping onto her porch. The place felt lived in, warm. A small table sat between two wicker chairs, the paint slightly chipped from years of use. A potted lavender plant filled the air with a soft, calming scent, blending with the earthy aroma of freshly brewed coffee. She handed me a mug, the ceramic warm against my palm, and gestured for me to sit. We began with small talk, the kind neighbors are expected to share, favorite restaurants, how the neighborhood looked in spring, what I did for work. But slowly, almost seamlessly, the conversation deepened. She asked about the books I liked, and when I mentioned one, her eyes lit up, and she admitted she had read it years ago. She told me about the music she played when she couldn't sleep, about the half-written journal entries she sometimes left unfinished because life got in the way. I found myself listening more than talking, drawn in by the layers of her voice, the way her words carried both weight and gentleness. Every detail felt intimate, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she leaned in to hear me better, the way her fingers curved around her mug as though savoring its warmth. There were pauses, too. Not awkward silences, but moments where the air thickened with meaning. I could hear the creak of the porch wood beneath us, the chirp of birds in the distance, the soft stirring of the wind. In those pauses, our eyes met, and I felt as though we were both silently acknowledging a truth neither of us was ready to voice. By the time I left, the coffee long finished, I realized something had shifted again. It wasn't just neighborly kindness. It was something quieter, more dangerous, a connection that carried the weight of possibility. The shift happened on a warm evening, the kind where the air feels heavy but inviting, and neighbors linger outside a little longer than usual. I was sitting on my porch steps when she appeared across the yard, carrying a watering can. She wore a loose summer dress, pale yellow with thin straps, and the fading light made her look like she belonged to the evening itself. We started talking casually, about the weather, about how quickly summer seemed to be slipping away. She teased me for always being outside at the strangest times, saying it was as if I were guarding the street. I laughed, shrugging, admitting that maybe I just liked the quiet after the world had settled down. There was an ease in the exchange, but beneath it ran something sharper, a current that made every word feel like it carried two meanings. At one point, when I joked about her roses looking like they belonged in a magazine, she gave me that look again, amused, measured, a little too curious. And then she said it. A soft chuckle slipped from her lips as she shook her head. "You're so bold." It was meant as a tease, I knew that. But the way she said it, with her eyes steady on mine, her voice dropping just slightly, made it feel heavier. My heart stumbled, but instead of retreating, something inside me answered back before I could think better of it. "And you're so tempting." The words hung there, suspended in the space between us. I hadn't planned them, hadn't even considered them until they left my mouth. Her reaction was immediate, though not what I expected. She didn't flinch. She didn't frown. Instead, she froze, her lips parting slightly as though the word had touched something she hadn't wanted to name. For a second, neither of us spoke. The air felt charged, alive, and even the evening breeze seemed to pause. I caught the faintest flicker in her eyes, surprise, yes, but also a spark of something unguarded. She looked away, just for a heartbeat, then back again, and in that silence, an understanding passed between us. She didn't scold me, didn't laugh it off. Instead, she gave the smallest smile, one that seemed caught between caution and curiosity. And without saying anything more, she turned toward her door, her steps slower than usual. I sat there long after she went inside, my chest tight, realizing we had crossed a line we could never uncross. The night after our exchange lingered in my mind like a song that refuses to end. I replayed her smile, her pause, the way she turned away without closing the door entirely. Something had changed between us, and it wasn't just in my imagination. A few evenings later, I found myself walking along the neighborhood streets just as the sky turned indigo. The streetlights hummed quietly, casting circles of warm light on the pavement. I wasn't surprised when I saw her. She walked with an easy grace, her hands tucked into the pockets of her light jacket, as if the night itself belonged to her. Out late again, she teased when our paths crossed, her voice carrying a softness that told me she wasn't here by accident either. "Guess I like the quiet," I replied. "And maybe the company." She smiled faintly, but her eyes were more serious than before. We walked together, our steps naturally falling into rhythm. The silence between us wasn't heavy, it was expectant, like something waiting to be said. And then, slowly, she let it spill. "I've lived here a long time," she began, her gaze fixed ahead. "People see me as independent, maybe even unshakable. But the truth is," she trailed off, as if searching for words she rarely allowed herself to admit. "Sometimes independence is just a nicer word for loneliness." Her honesty hit me harder than I expected. I didn't interrupt. I didn't try to fix it. I just listened, letting her voice fill the night air. She spoke about how friends drifted away, how age changed the way people looked at her, respected, admired, but always at a distance. "It's strange," she said softly, "to feel visible and invisible at the same time." I slowed my pace, looking at her, and for once she didn't avert her eyes. There was vulnerability there, something unguarded. Without thinking, I brushed my hand lightly against her arm, a gesture so small it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. She glanced down at where my fingers had touched, and though I pulled back quickly, she gave a quiet smile, not of amusement, but of gratitude. We walked on, the crickets singing their endless song, the world around us hushed and still. In that quiet, I felt something shift again. It wasn't just attraction anymore. It was trust being given, piece by fragile piece. That night, under the lamplight, I realized that what bound us wasn't boldness or temptation alone. It was the courage to let someone else see the truth we usually keep hidden. It was the kind of storm that arrived without warning, rolling in on a hot summer evening when the sky was still streaked with gold. The first distant rumble of thunder had me looking up, but before I could retreat inside, the clouds opened. Rain fell in sudden sheets, heavy and insistent, drumming against rooftops and splashing onto the pavement. I sprinted toward my porch, only to see her across the yard, gathering the cushions from her outdoor chairs in a hurried rush. Without thinking, I called out, offering to help, but she waved me off with a smile, that smile that made it impossible to look away. Moments later, soaked and laughing softly to herself, she darted to her porch, where I followed soon after, drawn by something stronger than the weather. We sat side by side on her steps, close enough that our shoulders brushed, though neither of us moved away. The air smelled of rain and damp earth, mingling with the faint trace of her perfume, warm, steadying, familiar now. Water streamed from the gutters, and the rhythm of the storm wrapped us in its own cocoon. She shivered lightly, goosebumps rising along her arms. Without hesitation, I slipped off my jacket and draped it around her shoulders. For a moment, she simply looked at me, not with surprise, but with something deeper, something unspoken. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, soft and vulnerable. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling the jacket tighter. We didn't talk much. Words felt unnecessary, as if the storm had silenced everything but what truly mattered. I could feel the warmth of her shoulder against mine, steady and grounding, even as the world around us roared with thunder. Each brush of her arm against mine sent sparks down to my fingertips, though I kept them still in my lap. At one point, she tilted her head slightly, watching the rain fall beyond the porch. "Funny," she said softly, almost to herself. "Sometimes storms feel less like chaos and more like clarity." I turned toward her, the dim porch light illuminating her face. Raindrops clung to her hairline, and in her eyes, I saw something that stopped me cold, not just longing, but permission. Permission to see her not just as my neighbor, not just as someone older and out of reach, but as a woman who wanted to be seen. The storm kept raging, but in that moment, I felt a quiet certainty. Whatever this was, it was no longer just chance. It was something neither of us could ignore. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind streets washed clean and a sky brushed in pale gold. The air carried the freshness that only comes after rain, that soft mixture of damp earth and blooming flowers. I was still lingering over breakfast when I heard a gentle knock at my door. When I opened it, she stood there holding a small plate, covered with a linen napkin. Her hair was still slightly tousled, her dress simple, a pale cream color that caught the morning light. She smiled, a little hesitant this time, and lifted the plate toward me. "I baked these earlier," she said, her tone warm but shy. "Thought you might like some." I accepted the plate, uncovering it to find muffins, still faintly warm. The smell of cinnamon drifted up, and I couldn't help but smile. "You didn't have to." "I know," she replied softly, her eyes meeting mine with a steadiness that felt different than before. Less guarded. "But I wanted to." I invited her inside, and we ended up at the small table by my window, the morning light spilling across the room. We ate in easy silence at first, the kind that felt natural, not forced. She laughed gently when I admitted the muffins were better than anything I could ever attempt, her laughter soft and unpolished, the kind that lingers. At one point, as I reached for another muffin, her hand brushed against mine. This time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers linger there, resting lightly atop mine, as though testing the weight of what we both already knew. My breath caught, and when I looked up, her gaze was waiting for me. There was no game in her eyes, no teasing, no hesitation, only quiet acceptance. "Last night," she said, her voice low, "I realized something. It's been a long time since I let myself feel this." I didn't answer right away. Words seemed clumsy compared to the gravity of her admission. Instead, I turned my hand, gently weaving my fingers through hers. She exhaled, a soft release of tension, and in that silence, everything was said. The world outside moved on, birds calling, cars passing, the hum of life resuming. But inside, time felt slower, steadier. We weren't neighbors anymore, not in the way we had been. We were something else now, two people who had found, against all expectation, a quiet courage in each other. It wasn't boldness alone, nor temptation. It was the choice to lean into something real. And in that moment, with her hand in mine and the morning light wrapping us both, I knew this was only the beginning.